What History Omits. Regarding Lee's surrender at Appomattox. Part 2. On April 9, 1865, the atmosphere is laden with historical significance as two prominent figures prepare to convene in a serene Virginia village. One of them is RobertELee, the esteemed and dignified leader of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. He approaches Appomattox Courthouse, his uniform pristine and his ceremonial sword shining at his side, representing honor even in the face of defeat. The other individual is Ulysses S. Grant, the commander of the Union forces, who arrives later clad in a coat muddied from the elements, more reminiscent of an ordinary soldier than a general. Within a simple brick residence owned by Wilmer McLean, these two leaders engage in conversation, sign important documents, and exchange a handshake. Outside, soldiers await with bated breath, some remaining silent, while others shed tears. It appears to be the conclusion of a long struggle, a moment that has been enshrined in history as the termination of America's most devastating conflict, the Civil War. However, what if this was not the definitive end? What if the encounter at Appomattox was merely a fragment of a larger narrative? Why did Lee capitulate despite his resolute declarations against surrender? Was this meeting orchestrated for its symbolic significance? Did one of Lee's trusted generals influence his decision to surrender? Furthermore, why did hostilities persist for an additional 16 months following this pivotal day? Today we will explore the aspects of this historical event that are frequently overlooked, revealing the hidden truths surrounding Lee's surrender and its subsequent implications. Before we delve deeper, please consider liking and subscribing to our channel to support our community. General RobertELee once famously asserted that he would prefer to face 1,000 deaths rather than yield to Ulysses S. Grant. For many years, he had epitomized Confederate resistance, recognized as a brilliant strategist who commanded his forces through some of the most renowned battles of the war, including Antietam, Gettysburg, and Chancellorsville. His determination appeared unwavering. However, by early April 1865, the situation had shifted dramatically. Following nearly 10 months of grueling trench warfare surrounding Petersburg and Richmond, Union troops under General Grant finally breached the Confederate defenses on April 2nd at Five Forks. This development compelled Lee to evacuate both cities, the core of the Confederacy, and retreat westward with his famished and weary army. The retreat proved to be a harrowing ordeal. Upon reaching Amelia Courthouse on April 5th, Lee anticipated finding urgently needed supplies. Unfortunately, none were available. His soldiers were starving, disheartened, and persistently pursued by Union cavalry led by General Philip Sheridan. On April 6th, at Sailor's Creek, nearly a quarter of Lee's forces were either captured or killed in a single catastrophic confrontation. Witnessing this calamity reportedly prompted Lee to exclaim, "My God, has the army been dissolved?" By April 8th, it became evident that escape was impossible. Union forces had obstructed Lee's route at Appomattox Station and seized crucial supplies intended for his troops. Surrounded on all fronts and devoid of reinforcements or avenues of escape, Lee faced the momentous decision to confer with Grant regarding terms of surrender. Despite his previous commitment to never capitulate, Lee opted for practicality over pride. He recognized that persisting in combat would only lead to further needless bloodshed and suffering, not only for his soldiers, but also for the civilians throughout the South who had already endured 4 years of devastation. As Lee grappled with the choice to surrender, one of his most trusted generals significantly influenced his decision. James Longstreet served alongside General RobertELee for much of the Civil War, distinguished as a pragmatic leader who prioritized logical assessment over emotional responses. By early April 1865, Longstreet came to the realization that further resistance was pointless. The Army of Northern Virginia faced overwhelming odds, being outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and depleted of supplies. On April 9th, at Appomattox Station, General John B. Gordon conveyed that his corps had been severely weakened during an engagement with Union cavalry obstructing their advance westward. With no prospects of breaching Union lines or obtaining reinforcements, Longstreet is said to have counseled Lee that surrender was their only remaining option. Nevertheless, not all officers concurred with Longstreet's practical viewpoint. Brigadier General Edward Porter Alexander proposed disbanding the Army into smaller units to engage in guerrilla warfare against Union forces, a tactic he believed could extend their resistance indefinitely. However, both Longstreet and Lee dismissed this suggestion. Longstreet's role during these critical moments exemplified his overarching strategy throughout the conflict, which focused on making practical decisions to reduce unnecessary suffering, even if it entailed accepting defeat. A compelling question that historians have explored is whether Lee's surrender at Appomattox was a staged event, not in the sense of being insincere, but rather as a meticulously planned moment intended for symbolism and reconciliation. General Ulysses S. Grant extended remarkably generous terms to Lee and his troops. Confederate soldiers were permitted to return home after surrendering their weapons, while officers were allowed to retain their sidearms and personal horses with no threat of prosecution as long as they adhered to their paroles. Grant also provided sustenance for Lee's famished soldiers, totaling 25,000 meals. These terms were not merely practical, they carried profound symbolic significance. By enabling Confederate soldiers to return home with dignity and retain their horses for agricultural purposes, Grant fostered a spirit of reconciliation rather than retribution. This strategy was not solely the decision of General Grant, it also embodied President Abraham Lincoln's aspiration for a harmonious reunification of the North and South. The location of the surrender, Wilmer McLean's residence, further contributed to its symbolic significance. McLean had relocated there after his former home near Bull Run was damaged during one of the initial battles of the war in 1861. Now, 4 years later, destiny had once again placed him at the center of historical events as the conflict concluded within his home. Whether this was mere coincidence or a meticulously planned occurrence remains uncertain. However, it is evident that Appomattox transcended a mere military surrender, evolving into a representation of national reconciliation. Although Appomattox is often viewed as a pivotal moment in American history, it did not signify the complete dissolution of the Confederacy, as is commonly assumed. General RobertELee surrendered solely his Army of Northern Virginia, leaving other Confederate forces still operational throughout the South. At that time, numerous Confederate armies remained active in various regions. General Joseph E. Johnston commanded a significant number of troops in North Carolina until his surrender on April 26th, following negotiations with General Sherman 17 days after the events at Appomattox. Meanwhile, Lieutenant General Richard Taylor continued to resist Union forces in Alabama and Mississippi until May 4th, when he surrendered after learning of Johnston's capitulation. In the Western Territories, Lieutenant General Edmund Kirby Smith held out even longer, refusing to surrender until May 26th in Galveston, Texas. In the region known today as Oklahoma, Brigadier General Stan Watty, a Cherokee leader overseeing Native American forces, held out against surrender until June 23rd, making him the final Confederate general to capitulate. Similarly, Confederate President Jefferson Davis did not acknowledge defeat after his escape from Richmond on April 2nd. Captured on May 10th near Irwinville, Georgia, Davis maintained that guerrilla warfare could revive Southern aspirations for independence, a sentiment echoed by several Confederate commanders who persisted in their efforts well into mid-1865. While April 9, 1865, is frequently regarded as the symbolic conclusion of the Civil War, the situation was considerably more intricate. General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse signified the end of his Army of Northern Virginia, yet it did not imply that the entire Confederacy had surrendered. In reality, hostilities persisted in various regions of the South for weeks and even months following Appomattox. It was not until August 20th, 1866, 16 months later, that President Andrew Johnson officially declared the Civil War concluded. This extended timeline can be attributed to slow communication, fragmented Confederate resistance, ongoing skirmishes, and political delays, all of which highlighted the deep divisions that remained in the nation even after Lee's surrender. In 1865, communication across the United States was markedly slower and less reliable than it is today. The news of Lee's surrender on April 9th took several days, and in some instances weeks, to reach other Confederate leaders dispersed across extensive territories. In the absence of confirmation regarding Lee's capitulation or the fall of Richmond, many Confederate generals continued their campaigns, believing their cause was still viable. The surrender at Appomattox is often commemorated as the moment when hostilities ceased and the nation began its healing process. However, as we have explored, this narrative represents only a portion of the broader story. Lee's surrender did not signify the end of the Confederacy, nor did it usher in immediate peace. Rather, it was a symbolic gesture, embodying dignity and the potential for reconciliation. The reverberations of the war would persist for months, if not years, as the divided nation endeavored to reconstruct itself. What if Lee had opted for guerrilla tactics rather than capitulation? What if Jefferson Davis had successfully evaded capture and reassembled Confederate forces? Might the conflict have prolonged even further, or could it have culminated in even more extensive destruction? These inquiries continue to resonate within this historical narrative. We now invite you to share your insights. Was Lee's choice to surrender a demonstration of honor or an unavoidable conclusion? Was Grant's approach of leniency a strategic move towards reconciliation or a lost chance for accountability? What lessons can we extract from a moment that signified both an end and a new beginning? We welcome your thoughts in the comments section below. We are eager to hear your views on one of the most significant events in American history. Additionally, you may explore our previous documentaries, which include topics such as Africa's bloodiest civil war, the IBB coup of 1985, Nigeria's first military coup in 1966, the fall of Gaddafi, the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa, the aftermath of the Hiroshima explosion, the Battle of Berlin, and the narrative of the Native American sharpshooter, among others.